Hello everyone, this is our learning team project of Syrian after terrorism. My name is Taylor Sally and I'll be starting off with the introduction. Then it will be Ali Hall and last but not least Heather Lucas. My learning team decided on Syrian act of terrorism because it makes a big impact to history. It doesn't just make headlines on the news because it involves the world, especially since there are innocent lives that are involved. During this course, we learned that it is important to get involved if needed, and what is our place through it, especially if we take actions to help. We cannot just stand and watch innocent civilians dying and ignoring it. As a country, we should have a positive intention and justifiable actions of a positive outcome. The most recent terrorist attacks in Syria involved our country, so we should be aware. On December 17, 2010, Arab Spring Protest was formed, and they were the people who were seeking out to demand reforms, the dismissal of President Bashar al-Assad, allowing political parties, demanding equal rights, freedom of speech, press, and assembly. The protests included people from Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. The protests finally ended in Syria in the middle of the March. A month later, the government formally declared repeal of an emergency law that was created in 1963 that allowed government to suspend constitutional rights. In conclusion of that protest, President al-Assad decided to use force against his own people. Al-Assad wanted to be the dictator that stepped up instead of stepping down. He called on his troops to put down any protesters to make an example to others who are planning to go against him too. He dropped bombs on the protesters, innocent civilians, and anyone who was around. President al-Assad believes that violence was the answer to his movement. This was the start of Syrian civil war. There were over a dozen of terrorist attacks in Syria in the past 6 years. These are the top 3 events that stood out the most from killing so many civilians in such a short period of time. For the incident that happened on January 23, 2015, there was a truck filled with chlorine that killed over 50 civilians, and later half of them were pronounced dead. In March to April 2014, there was a chlorine bomb in 2 cities that had 200 civilians injured and 105 that passed away. The worst incident of them all was on August 2013. There were rockets filled with sarin nerve gas and released to 12 different areas. 1,500 people died, and that included 500 children, and 2,200 were injured. Earlier this month, President Trump held a press interview where he explained that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was terrible for committing so many crimes. He explained how events that should never have happened are happening, so it is our job to change that. On April 6, 2017, President Trump had a meeting with his national security team that prepared the military to have warships and aircraft ready to go. U.S. attacked by launching 60 Tomahawk cruise missiles at Syrian government airbase. President Trump decided to take action after finding out that many innocent lives were affected, especially innocent children and babies. The event led the U.S. government to drop missiles on the airbase to stop if they can or to slow down as we focus on the civilians.
The Syrian attacks of April 2017 have saddened many people, that the terrorists can use one of the most toxic gases of the known chemical warfare agents that can cause death in minutes. The video that was distributed claimed that the attack happened around 6:30 a.m. Several large plumes of smoke and the sound of an explosion that had thumped the earth. Witnesses heard planes, and one witness went to investigate where he had saw the bomb drop. He saw a rocket that had not exploded. He said, "I saw black oozing out of the casing. We have been hit by many rockets before, but I had never seen anything like this. This is a silent and deadly attack." Workers went door to door to find whole families dead in their beds. This is a silent killer, and it works its way through the body slowly. The chemicals attack and leave no marks. The U.S. launched 59 Tomahawk missiles from warships in the eastern Mediterranean to Syrian airfield towards their logistical storage, ammunition supply bunkers, air defense system, and things that make the airfield operate. Although Assad is launching chemical weapons on his people, and Trump is not, both the US and Syria are dealing with the same problem: chemical weapons. These two countries have events, like missiles, that can affect each other. Syria is affected because one of the biggest Air Force bases is destroyed, and the US is affected because Syria's promise to the United Nations not to use chemical weapons was broken. Syrian President Assad recently attacked his people with chemical bombs. People around the world are reacting to his horrid behaviors, especially US President Donald Trump. On April 7th, President Trump launched missiles at the Air Force base that Assad would have launched his chemical bombs from. There can be no dispute that Syria used banned chemical weapons, violated its obligations under Chemical Weapons Convention, and ignored urging from the UN Security Council. Trump stated later that night years of previous attempts at charging Assad's behavior have failed, and failed very dramatically. The Russians have gotten on Trump's nerves lately. Trump says that Putin had agreed to monitor Assad and make sure no chemical weapons were used, yet they obviously lied to him because the bombs were dropped only a few days before Trump's attack.
Jus ad bellum. The right to war is a set of criteria that are to be consulted before engaging in war in order to determine whether entering into war is permissible, that is, whether it is a just war. First criteria, just cause. A war is justified when only waged for one or more causes. Example, preventing human rights violations. 2. Legitimate authority. The use of military power is permissible only if it is authorized by a political body. 3. Right intentions. A war must be waged with pursuit of its just cause as its sole motive, primary. For example, genocide, not economic gain, resources, or territorial expansion. 4. Last resort. Non-military alternatives, including diplomacy, negotiations, sanctions, and legal adjudication must be pursued prior to military force bombardment. 5. Reasonable chance of success. A war should be fought only if there is a reasonable hope that the goals embedded in just cause will be realized, for example, enduring peace. And 6. Proportionality. The anticipated goods of waging a war must be proportionate to its expected evils. The harms must not outweigh the benefits. In order to be justified in going to war, there are 6 criterions that must be met. The problem is that the criterion are easily manipulated to justify even the most heinous of crimes, up to and including violent acts of terrorism, much like both the chemical attack on Syria earlier this month and the response from the United States sending missiles to the alleged airport in which it is thought that the chemical attacks came from. So the question is, from the eyes of Assad, how do these criterion meet his intentions for the war to be justified? And how was the U.S. response to send missiles, not just another attack on Syria? Well, it all depends on the point of view. Political Cartoon by Imad Hajjaj is just one of the many points of view coming out of Syria. From Syria's civilians' point of view, the chemical attack on the innocents was backed by the Syrian government, and Bashar al-Assad is to blame. Backing al-Assad and the Syrian government with support is Russia's President Vladimir Putin, and some say closely affiliated with Putin is none other than the United States President Donald Trump. This picture depicts the people of Syria being hushed to death by a chemical gas in the hands of al-Assad, with both Russia and the United States backing Assad's actions. Bashar al-Assad's point of view of the latest chemical attack is that it is 100% fabricated. Al-Assad and those backing al-Assad claim that the attacks were fabricated and that in fact the details of the attack were made up in order to give the United States an excuse to bomb a Syrian airbase in retaliation. Bashar al-Assad suggests that the images showing children in the attack on a rebel-held town in Idlib province, which incited so much horror and shock around the globe, were staged. Al-Assad goes on to state that the reported details of what happened were also not credible because their source was al-Qaeda's former affiliate and Syria Nusra Front. So is Bashar al-Assad a cynical liar or a president fighting for the best interests of his country? How does Assad justify jus ad bellum? It would appear that Assad's intentions is to fight the rebels that want Assad to back down. Assad pointed out, and of course he's right, that rebels attack government-held territory and kill civilians, often indiscriminately. He said death comes with war. Again, this is all correct. But 2 wrongs don't make a right, and the whole point of international humanitarian law is to regulate the use of force so that non-combatants are protected. At this point, we must ask ourselves if al-Assad is justifying the terrorism with excuses, or does his motives have no justification in complete disregard to the just war traditions that the rest of the world uses as a guide for declaring war? Another key component to just war is jus in bello, the criteria that restricts how one conducts a war. Non-combatants may not be directly or intentionally targeted, and the collateral damage caused by individual acts of war must not be disproportionate. The recent chemical attacks show no concept of the jus in bello criteria. Is this in blatant disregard on Bashar al-Assad's part? Of course, with war comes casualties and death. But how can Assad not see that the ways of fighting this war in Syria is not consistent with a set of rules of not only jus in bello, but also the pledge that he made to turn over all chemical weapons? Why did these acts of terrorism occur? No one goes into war thinking that they are not justified or that they are fighting on the wrong side of the war. As Michael Walzer quoted in his book, Arguing About War, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But in this stance, we are not able to recognize the injustices of war, condemn the disregard to jus in bello, nor oppose it. When the fight for one or the other side becomes so significant that one or more of the rules for war are ignored, it is no longer a just war. This creates chaos and a mentality of anything goes to secure the win. The just war traditions are meant to curtail this from happening, and when the rules are being ignored and not enforced, terrorism will reign. The last important component to a just war is jus post bellum. What happens after the war? After the war has ended, how can we just walk away, leaving the survivors with no way of survival in their torn up country? How do we restore peace from conflict? Humanitarian efforts are one way that we can help. Fundraisers across the world are popping up after the focus of attention on the war crimes against the Syrian people. Israel has donated thousands of shekels to help those caught in the conflict. The organization Israel Gives says that no Jew can stay silent as children are being gassed in the streets of Syria. Its fundraising page reads, "We cannot sit back any longer and watch the horrors play out. We need to act, and here's a way." Many are looking at the case for accepting Syrian refugees. Chilean residents are protesting and demanding that their government accept more refugees. Additionally, food and life-saving services and supplies are other ways that we can help, and there are many organizations that you can choose from to donate funds if you want to help.